Hello, everyone, and welcome to the TDWI webinar program. I'm Andrew Miller, and I'll be your moderator. For today's program, we're going to have an expert panel on accelerating cloud data modernization, and our sponsors today are Alteryx and Unravel Data. For our presentations, we'll hear first from Fern Halper with TDWI, and after Fern speaks, we'll be joined by Mark Sarbuski and with Alteryx and Chris Meyer with Unravel Data for a roundtable discussion. Before I turn over the time to our speakers, I'd like to go over a few basics. Today's webinar will be about an hour long. At the end of their presentations, our speakers will host a question and answer period. And if at any time during these presentations you'd like to submit a question, just use the Ask a Question area on your screen to type in your question. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please click on the Help area located below the slide window, and you'll receive technical assistance. If you'd like to discuss this webinar on Twitter with fellow attendees, just include the hashtag with TDWI in your tweets. Finally, if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, use the click here for a PDF line there on the left middle of your console. And we are recording today's event, and we'll be emailing you a link for an archived version so you can view the presentation again later if you choose, or if you'd like to share it with a colleague. Again, today we're going to be discussing accelerating cloud data modernization, and our first speaker is Fern Halper. She's TDWI Vice President and Senior Director for TDWI Research for Advanced Analytics. Well known in the analytics community, Fern has published hundreds of articles, research reports, speeches, and webinars on data mining and information technology during the past 20 years. Fern is also the co-author of several dummies books on cloud computing, the hybrid cloud, and big data. At TDWI, she focuses on advanced analytics, including predictive analytics, social media analysis, text analytics, cloud computing, and big data analytics approaches. She has been a partner at industry analyst firm Hurwitz & Associates and a lead analyst for Bell Labs. Her PhD is from Texas A&M University. Please welcome Fern, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion on accelerating cloud data modernization. I think it's an important topic, and I'm glad that you could join us today. So I'm going to kick things off. I'm going to talk about some evolving use cases for modern data management and how the cloud helps with modern data management. But it's a panel discussion, so we're going to spend the bulk of our hour in the panel discussion with Mark and Chris from Alteryx and Unravel, getting their perspectives on the topic. And of course, as Andrew mentioned, we want to hear from you too, so be sure to ask us questions, and we're saving time at the end of the panel for those. So the data landscape is changing. What we're seeing at TDWI is that organizations are collecting large volumes of diverse data. So this includes unstructured data and semi-structured data and geospatial data and machine data, image data, you get the idea. In recent surveys, more than 40% of respondents were collecting unstructured data. 20% in our recent surveys were already collecting machine data, and geospatial data was in the mainstream. And not only were organizations collecting diverse types of data, they were also collecting large volumes of data with hundreds of terabytes and even petabytes of data collected by many organizations. And one of the main use cases for this data is for advanced analytics. And that includes analytics like machine learning, natural language processing, and more. So in fact, demand for these technologies remains strong. In a 2022 survey, for instance, over 60% of the respondents said that the demand for machine learning was increasing. So why are they collecting these new kinds of data? Because they're helping to solve business problems. They're enriching the data that organizations already have, helping them to, answer more complex questions. For example, these are just some examples that are pulled from recent magazine articles. So for instance, location data is being used in utilities to understand and operate and optimize, various energy initiatives, for example, renewable energy. These programs that are using geospatial data along with more advanced analytics include things like load planning on the utility, predictive maintenance of a tower or, some other asset, smart grid design, outage response management, or orchestrating, various teams to get to where they need to go, so orchestrating their workflow. In healthcare, I was just reading an article today that was talking about researchers being able to predict unplanned hospitalizations for cancer patients using wearable information. There's work being done on using deep learning algorithms that can learn image features to look for similar cases within large image repositories for rare diseases, for example, or even something shown up here, how AI can detect signs of mental health decline in text messages, so using NLP or text analysis, to be able to look at what people are saying between perhaps the patient and the provider. So in retail, managers are using apps, where they're looking at their data, like RFID data on a tablet. That's letting them know in real time, what's selling and what isn't selling so that they can make decisions. They can drive real-time inventory replenishment through applications by monitoring the shelves, that need to be resupplied. I mean, those are obviously, I'm just touching the surface of the kinds of applications that are out there. And, these applications are showing examples of diverse data, be that structured data or unstructured data, but, all of this is helping to drive insights. So the reality is that the on-premises data warehouse often can't meet the needs for these new use cases. So for instance, in a 2022 survey, I have here that only 16%, so less than 20% of the respondents were saying that their traditional on-premises data warehouse was fitting their needs. The rest were either modernizing their architecture or they were planning to modernize their environment. And an important part, obviously, of this modernization is moving to the cloud for the flexibility and the scalability that's required to support these new data types and these new use cases that I was just talking about. And it may not be just one cloud environment. It might be a multiple cloud environment. So you've heard multi-cloud. You may have heard that term. And so that means that organizations are using more than one cloud provider to meet their needs. So they may feel that one cloud is suited for one purpose, another for another purpose. We routinely at TDWI, we see organizations in more than one cloud. Our average number among those who are using the cloud is 2 providers. So in terms of moving to the cloud, this survey was done in early 2022, and in it we asked, what data management and analytics tools does your organization currently use? And you can see by the smaller bracket, I have the small bracket in purple and then the other bracket in orange. And there's a small bracket is looking at the difference between the data warehouse on premises and the data warehouse in the cloud. And you could see that the gap there isn't that big. It's like 61% were using a data warehouse on premises and 55% were using a data warehouse in the cloud. So that gap is definitely narrowing. Likewise, if you look at that orange bracket, more respondents to this survey were using a data, a data lake in the cloud than a data lake on premises, like 40-something% to 20-something%. Data lake often where some of this newer kind of data is also being stored and analyzed. And so that's a pretty wide gap. So, what are some of the considerations, with modern data and modern platforms? We're going to talk a lot more about this in the panel, but I just wanted to highlight a few things. In terms of modern data platforms in the cloud, you want to think about how you're going to manage your data, how you're going to analyze it, how you're going to govern it, of course, how you're going to migrate the data to the cloud in the first place, and the cost considerations around that. And, what about new tooling? Automated tooling is starting to become popular across the data and analytics lifecycle, be that to support processing or tools to support different personas that may not be as technical. So there's a big move now to democratize data and analytics, so to provide self-service tools for insights, for pipelines, across this lifecycle. And so as organizations want to democratize and make data available to people across the organization, what are the tools, that may help with that? What about automation for observability, to see what's happening in these complex environments? We're talking about multiple cloud environments, multiple platforms, what's happening across those platforms, which will obviously also play into governance, and et cetera. There's a lot of considerations. I just wanted to tee up a few of those before we moved into the panel discussion. I also wanted to ask you all a poll question, which is about multi-cloud, since we were talking about that. So how many cloud providers does your organization use for data management? So are you not in the cloud at all? Maybe none, 1, 2, 3, more than 3? As I said, at TDWI, we're seeing on average 2, but we wanted to hear from you to see what you're using. And I'm talking about the public cloud. So I'll give you a second to answer those questions, to put in your response. Okay, so 66% using 2. All right, so pretty much the same as what we've been seeing. I hope I didn't, force your answer there by saying 2, and so you said 2. But I think that's probably, pretty much where we are. So with that, let me hand it back over to Andrew, who's going to introduce our panelists for the roundtable discussion. So Andrew, back over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Fern. Nice presentation there. Just a quick reminder to our audience, if you do have a question, you can enter it at any time in the Ask a Question window. We will be answering the audience questions in the final portion of our program. This does bring me to our next speaker. It's Mark Sadriski with Alteryx. Mark brings 25 plus years of experience to his role as VP of Marketing at Alteryx Trifacta, where he leads a team responsible for global marketing activities. Prior to joining Alteryx, Mark served as CMO at Trifacta, Kentic, Castlight Health, and Anaplan, helping to scale those market-leading SaaS businesses. He also held executive product and product marketing roles at Mercury Interactive and Hewlett-Packard. Mark earned an MBA from the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia and a computer science degree from UC Davis. We're also joined by Chris Meyer with Unravel Data. Chris is a solution engineer at Unravel, helping customers manage and optimize some of the most complex modern data stacks in the world. Previously, he spent nearly 5 years as a solution architect, creating and implementing complex applications. His experience in the data ops domain allows Chris to help customers get the most out of their modern data stack. Please welcome Mark and Chris. And with that, Fern, I'll hand it back over to you for the roundtable.
Sounds good. Thanks. And welcome, Mark and Chris. So let's get started with a question. I was talking about all the different types of data that I see organizations using. What new kinds of data are your customers utilizing, and what are your clients doing with it? And also, what's different about the new kinds of data in terms of managing and analyzing it? So Mark, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. You actually, so thank you, and it's great to be here. You hit on some of the big ones that we see. A lot of geospatial image and image recognition. So there's a bunch of that. And I would say too, there's another thing that we're seeing, which is it's the sort of massive combinations of data, even if the data, it's not sort of say new data type. So and probably a great example of this is some of the firms that we worked with that were unraveling the data challenges around COVID, right? So they had huge public data sets that were coming from all over the place. And some of them were images and lots of numerical data and lots of, statistics, obviously geographic data, hospital data. And so trying to wrangle all of those things together what was almost like a new challenge, right? It was just lots of new data types, but also just the sources, and trying to get to a place where you could make sense of what was happening in near real time, right, to be able to help the hospitals, the medical providers, the public sector entities that were part of that. So that is kind of something we're seeing, obviously, for that problem set, but elsewhere. And then what's different about that is two things that we see. That when you start talking about that variety, and especially new data types, it becomes now analyzing that and preparing that data and analyzing it is a team sport, right? It requires a level of collaboration and multiple people with expertise being able to work together, bring their expertise to this broad variety of data, to be able to just get to that data set to a good spot. And then the second thing, so collaboration, making it a team sport, would really be the bringing AI to bear on the analysis part, the true advanced analytics. There's so much data of such variety that you really do need that level of sort of scale that AI can bring to find the different correlations and the different insights that are buried in all that data.
So you're seeing use of machine learning and other algorithms.
Absolutely. At two parts of the process, in the beginning to just understand and profile the data, and then as those data sets come together, actually, again, coming in and helping pull insights and correlations in that data that if you had to do them manually would take forever.
Yeah, and I was interested in something that you said when you were first answering the question. You were talking about the fact that there were more combinations, some more data sources that they had to bring together quickly, it seemed, to answer the questions, obviously, that needed to be answered with COVID.
That's right.
In that case. But do you see that in general, too, that organizations are having to bring data together faster?
I think it's two things. One, and I should certainly mention that probably wouldn't have been able to happen without the cloud, right? If you had to bring all of that, and you mentioned this, right, onto some on-premise data warehouse with its scale limitations, with access challenges, et cetera. But because you can do all of this in a cloud data store now, you eliminate some of those barriers. We see two things. You mentioned, I don't want to say that they're having to do this. I think COVID was a situation where they had to, right? That was just the nature of the problem. I actually see a lot of customers finding opportunity there. Like, I can finally now start to bring data from my systems of record, my Google Analytics, all of these other outside of my entity kind of data systems or, data sets, bring them together to find things that I wouldn't have been able to do before. So it's not so much I think they see opportunity in being able to combine data sets in a way they weren't able to before.
Yeah, that makes sense, for sure. Really enriching the data. I mean, I remember reading something somewhere once that even just using text data, if you extract text data from whatever source, in some cases it was the models that were both just using the text data were outperforming the models, with structured data only. And then if you think, you're combining the two, then it's, you're going to get a lot more insight. So that's interesting. Chris, how about you? What new kinds of data are your customers utilizing, and what are your clients doing with it?
So I think the interesting thing about this question is really, it's not, in my opinion, about the new types. It's what isn't data now, Look at a lot of these traditional companies that we have, things like UPS or Amazon, things like that. Like, they're not touting themselves as logistics companies or storefronts. A lot of them are touting themselves as data companies now. They have a lot of data that they brought together, a lot of data that they got, that they have on premises or in the cloud or wherever they're storing it. Everything is data at this point. A lot of us wear watches on our, these health tracking watches. That's data somewhere. So from my point of view, everybody's using data everywhere, and they're bringing it together. One of the things that Mark mentioned was they're bringing it together in new ways. The cloud has afforded everybody to not just have all this data, but also to marry it in a myriad of different ways that we've seen. From stores being able to track where you are in the store from your cell phone location to, data tracking for purchases and whatnot. So lots of new ways to analyze this data, lots of new ways to look at it. One of the things I'd love to talk about for a second is managing. If you listen to all the things that we've said so far, we're talking about tons of different systems. We're talking about, you might be deployed in EMR or Databricks, or, you might have a data lake warehouse somewhere. Like, there's so many different tools out there now to do the analysis, to store the data, that managing has become a little bit of a bear if you don't have the tools that support you. One of the biggest concerns that we deal with from our point of view is customers saying, I don't understand where we're using everything. I don't understand how it's being used, how much money I'm spending, where all this is. And that's different for the cloud. The cloud has afforded us this ability to have custom developed applications or very specific use cases with the data that we're dealing with. But the tools haven't quite caught up with it. So the teams are dealing with, this thing over here, this thing over here, this thing over here, everywhere they're dealing with that. So that's one of the different and new things that teams are having to deal with, is just with everything everywhere and the ability, the ease of use of the cloud. So teams can just spin something up, utilize it, and go about their merry way. It's just a matter of having an understanding and that insight into what they're doing and how they're doing it.
Okay, yeah, so we're talking about sort of new data types, which could be a lot of data types, according to Chris, sort of these new cloud platforms, but still the fact that probably some of the data is still spread amongst other systems anyway, because even if you try to centralize everything on the cloud, that can often be hard to do. And even if you're doing that, you still have to keep track of what's happening in some of the systems that may be feeding the cloud, for analysis. Is that what you're saying, Chris? Just trying to.
Yeah, but more or less. I mean, when you think about it, I know one of the questions later is going to be about migration or talking about moving to the cloud. If you don't fully move over to the cloud, if some people are going to have stuff on-prem, still, because they're just workloads they can't move to the cloud. There's going to be stuff on cloud. There's 20 different products on the cloud that you can deal with. So it's just a matter of having that observability into being able to see across the board. And that's one of the challenges that we're seeing. And it's something that is frankly different. On-prem, you kind of deal with what you have. You have a cluster. It's been deployed. You're working with it. There's not really 30 or 40 different applications, and the teams can't easily spin something up. Like, there's a whole process you have to go through. The cloud's ease of use and the cloud's ability for you to very quickly bring something on board has changed the game in terms of how these teams are managing things.
Yeah. So you were talking about migrating. Let's talk about that. I have here how do cloud platforms add value to new data types, but, also how can companies thinking about migrating to the cloud determine what could and should be migrated? So we talked a little bit about how the cloud can add value. Mark, if you want to take this one first, if there's anything else you want to add to that, but, how should we be thinking about what we should be moving to the cloud?
Yeah, it's what we see in our customers, right? So Alteryx been around for a while and has many thousands of customers, and for a long part of its history, it serves the business user really well, right? So, but tends to be that, like, the world was on premises, the data lived there, they were being pulled from systems of record and manipulated, and now with cloud coming in, IT and central analytics and security and regulatory frameworks are all now sort of part of that the move to the cloud. They're a factor in there, and so for us, it's that the cloud has so much opportunity. But as Chris was saying, the opportunity is both to be able to provide beautiful benefits like get all the data more or less in one place. I can have a data lake that finally kind of pulls all these different data types together. The accessibility of cloud, the scale, the processing power, all those benefits, if it doesn't come with governance and some level of sort of control and management capabilities, then it can certainly the opportunity for sprawl is huge, right? So I think those benefits, the key is to figure out how do I give the IT the control and governance that it needs, because the way we talk about it is that IT owns the data, but the business users know the data, right? So it necessarily is a collaboration of those groups, so the folks in the line of business with IT, to make the move to the cloud one that gives you all the benefits: self-service, democratization, scale, access anywhere, even outside, partners outside your company, with control, with fine-grained access control, with management, with oversight, to understand costs, all of those types of things. So yeah, you kind of have to think both sides of that to get the benefits. of the move to the cloud.
So do you think that it's not necessarily the case that you should be moving all of your data to the cloud? Like what would be the trade-offs?
I think it really it very much depends, and it will be sort of almost, if not company by company, industry by industry, right? Financial services is going to have a different risk profile than other industries. And we see that's exactly what we see in our customers, right? Everybody's moving to the cloud at some level, but some are putting new things or a somewhat part of their data infrastructure that they're super comfortable with, and others are like all in, right? I'm going. So it's not. I think there's enormous benefit to doing so, and we've definitely talked about some of those. But every company will go at it at a pace that makes sense for its industry, its risk profile, and we definitely see new things going into the cloud, and stuff that is higher risk and very stable. I think there's a level of comfort with. We don't need to move this for the sake of moving it. We're gonna take the low-hanging fruit and really get a huge value from the stuff that we are gonna move and migrate to the cloud, and we're gonna have a plan that's gonna unfold over some period of time.
Yeah, Chris, how about you? How can companies thinking about migrating to the cloud determine what could and should be migrated?
So that's an interesting question that we've been dealing with a lot at Unravel recently. One of the functions that we have is we help with the migration by giving insight into the data. What's there, what jobs you're running, what you're running on, things of that nature. So when you're moving to the cloud, how best to get there. And what we're finding is a lot of the migration that is going on is dealing with, like Mark said, some of the newer stuff, some of the things that are less risk averse, as the old saying goes, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. There's a lot of that going on, but there's also a large move for cost savings. They're looking at it just, we want to move over, we want to save money, we want to move faster, and that's really ultimately what it comes down to. We have found, for a lot of these organizations, outside of things that you can't move, like, for example, you mentioned Fin services. We have found that a lot of Fin services are operating hybrid because there's just some things you can't move to the cloud that, the regulations just won't allow you. But they're moving more and more of their resources into the cloud for a lot of times at scale. We've talked a lot about the amount of data, people accessing it. One of the big things is having wide ranged access to the data. Previously, it was kind of siloed. There wasn't real access into it. A lot of teams didn't have the ability to log in and just browse through it. Now with something like Snowflake, anybody could go in and just query the data. So it's opening up avenues. And that's really what the determination comes down to, is once it kind of starts and people realize and understand what's happening, the floodgates sort of open.
Could you just spend a minute talking about the type of tool that would help someone migrating their data to the cloud to determine whether they should be? I mean, you talked about Unravel having some tools to help with that. I'm just curious what that looks like.
Yeah, sure. So we do a data-driven approach, and what we mean by that is we get our tendrils into everything. So we're looking at the cluster as a whole. We're looking at all the jobs that are executed. We're looking at the queries that are happening. We're looking at everything as a whole, and then providing as much insight around that data as we can, and providing a realistic data-driven approach. And that's ultimately when you're making these sorts of migrations, that's what you really need. You can't just look at it and go, okay, I want to move my application to the cloud, and then buttons happen and the magic happens and things just go through. You can't take that approach. You have to have a partner or a platform associated with it to really get down into the data. Since we're talking about data, you need to get down into the data to be able to make that migration and make the best of it. Because if you're not basing it on the data, you're going to end up inevitably making mistakes. I mean, there's one company that we were dealing with recently that brought us in specifically because of the data that we can provide, because they were 2 years behind where they were migrating, because they thought that they could do it themselves.
Interesting. What's an example of, a metric or something that you would discover that would then say, you shouldn't be migrating this data to the cloud. It's going to cost you more than keeping it where it is or something like that. Am I thinking
so
about
with
that
all
correctly?
Sort of. So what we can do from our data perspective is we can run cost metrics against it and say, if you were to move to, let's say, EMR, if you were to move this workload to EMR, then it's going to cost you X number of dollars. That's the sort of thing that we can provide. The biggest help that we have is going to be from a data lineage standpoint, because everybody can talk all day about, I want to move this this Spark job or this Hive query or whatever into the cloud, but what a lot of the tools don't show you is the data where, what is it talking to? I have a Spark job. It is talking to this table. Well, this table was generated from somewhere. Where is it coming from? That's the sort of data that is extremely helpful when it comes to planning the migration to the cloud. It's being able to look at a job and say, okay, here's the lineage of where it comes from. Here's the data that it feeds into. Here's what it's talking to, which is then, another app is pulling into it. There's this very intricate web of information and data everywhere. So that's where a lot of our customers from a migration standpoint are seeing that value, and where where tools are helping from is being able to make sense of that web.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, all right, so we talked about migrating the data, looking at the data, determining what maybe should or shouldn't be moved. But what advice do you have for companies looking to democratize data and analytics? We were talking about that before, and how does the cloud even help with that? So, Mark, I'll throw that one to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the, the term's been around for a bit, but it's imperative that companies move in this direction. And I say that because of everything we've already said. There's more data, more variety, more needs for it, more opportunities for it. And consequently, you're never going to be able to hire enough data scientists, right? To sort of get the value from all of this type of data. So how do you get to a place where people directly in the business, as Chris was saying, are able to access the data, are able to transform the data and analyze the data in a way that helps them make decisions, the right decisions at the right time, faster, whatever you want, right? It's interesting with the cloud, right? It's maybe what we see sometimes is it's very obvious to focus on the big rocks. Am I going Snowflake? Am I going Databricks? Am I going, and those are obviously important decisions about what cloud data warehouse, data lake, what cloud platform am I going to take? What seems to sometimes get missed is how that end user that I want to be able to get access to this data and manipulate this data and be truly self-sufficient at some level with level of control. They can't be blowing things up. What that looks like, right? And so, to me, you start from that end user and you kind of work your way back, because if the business users cannot ever access the data, you can stand up this amazing cloud data lake or data warehouse or whatever. And if it's not actually utilized by the business, you're sort of in like Hadoop 2.0 land, right? It looked great on paper, but it's sort of a big, expensive science project that didn't really maybe pan out the way you hoped. And so to me, I think that just as a mindset, like what is it that, involve those end users, figure out what they're using, and what they're capable of, and really make it a collaborative approach to how are we going to truly democratize this? Because IT and the security teams and the compliance folks have a set of requirements. Those are often like at the top of the list, and what the poor end user is like not an equal partner in this. And I guess my advice is you've got to make them equal partners. You've got to be able to satisfy all of that stuff. And the great news is the cloud is perfect, right? The cloud, these are modern approach. Alteryx Analytics Cloud, it's a cloud first platform. It's got APIs. It will connect into what you want. It's any browser anywhere. It's built on the back of like a product that the end users have been happy with for a decade plus. So, and obviously that's my company, but that's, I think, another big advantage of the cloud is it was built with for both sides, for the people that need to have the control of things and be able to govern it with fine grain access, and those end users that we all know how to use a web page, right? And if it's intuitive enough, we'll use it.
So that's what you're saying. So if the tools are easy enough to use, what's an example of that for a business user in the cloud?
Well, I mean, I will of course point to sort of the designer cloud, right, from Alteryx. There's hundreds of thousands of people that have learned to use that. They bridged from Excel, which most business users are able to pick up or pick it up along the way, and the paradigms and the ease of use and the immediacy of that experience now can be brought to a product like Designer and Designer Cloud, where now you're actually doing pretty sophisticated data manipulation at scale against Snowflake or against Databricks, these massive data sets. And the technical skill required, I'm not writing SQL. But in fact, what's happening under the covers is I'm essentially performing the same actions, but through an interface that has been tailored for someone who's a business expert, but not a computer science person.
Yeah, I like that. Chris, how about you? What advice do you have for companies looking to democratize data and analytics?
You got to find good partners. You got to find good platforms to work with. One of the biggest benefits that we have with the cloud is the world is kind of your oyster. There's a tool made for literally everyone or any use case you can possibly think of, and there is new stuff coming up every day. There's the Alteryx of the world. There's the Unravels of the world. There's just so many different tools that you got to be able to find the tools that help you the most. If you need observability, you can look to Unravel to help with that observability from a modern data stack. That sort of thing. It's incredibly important to find something like that, because at the end of the day, as great as the cloud is, it kind of is the Wild West, and if you treat it that way, if you treat it the same way you've always treated your Hadoop platforms or your on-prem or whatever it is, you're going to get bit. We've dealt with multiple customers that have come to us saying, we really need some help with understanding where we're spending because we're just spending too much. I just got off a call just before this with a customer that they made an agreement with one of the cloud vendors, and it was like a 3-year agreement or something like that. They've already spent through their entire 3 years in 6 months. It is staggering how quickly you can burn through these things. So it's critically important to get an understanding and know that it's a different mindset. You have to use this differently, and you have to have the tools to bear to be able to understand where you're spending and what you're doing.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. And Chris, I'll start with you, because we see that also in our TDWI research, that sometimes cost is the number 2 sort of issue with the cloud. I think integrating the data, between sort of on-premises and cloud environments, that's also an issue, but cost is an issue. And so, I think what do organizations need to be aware of in moving their data to the cloud? And what if you have a multi-cloud environment? Because we saw most of the people, at least on this call, they're using 2. How can you avoid the potential high costs of migration? What do you do?
I'll start with that last question first. How to avoid the potential high costs of migration is going to come down to a data-driven approach. Again, I hate to sound like a broken record when I say this, because I talk to a lot of people all the time. The cloud is just different. It's not on-prem. You can't just throw hardware at it every once in a while, and it's a spend that you do every 3 or 5 years or whatever it might be. That bill is going to hit you every single month. So it takes a changing of the way you think about it and the way you look at the data and the way that you just manage everything when you're moving to the cloud. So that's the first bit is always going to be, you got to rethink it. You have to take a data-driven approach. You just have to look at it. You have to look at it differently. How you manage it, you're going to have to find good partners, especially when it comes to multi-cloud. As great as our tools are, as great as the cloud tools are, they're siloed essentially. If you have a deployment in Databricks in EMR or Databricks in Snowflake, they're all going to have their own interfaces. They're all going to have their own access into things. You're going to want to find platforms that can help you understand across the board. Have that single pane of glass. And really, the awareness in moving, it comes down to it's different. It's going to be something that it's going to take time. It's going to have an understanding of where this works, but ultimately the users need to understand that there is more to it than just executing their jobs. There's more to it than just saying, I need 200 cores and 500 gigs of RAM.
Right.
They need to be purposeful about the resources they're using, because at the end of the day, resources and time equal dollars in the cloud. So having a partner that can, help understand where the costs are being spent, but also how to optimize that cost to the best of the ability, it is going to be ideal. So I think when moving to the cloud, partners are critical, because they're going to help you provide those platforms that are going to be able to help you not only potentially do the move, stay on top of your spend, and just make sure that you don't get that $1 million bill at the end of the month when you're expecting that 6 months from now.
Yeah. Mark, how about you? What do organizations need to be aware of, and how can they avoid some of the cost concerns? And what about managing in a multi-cloud environment? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Chris nailed a bunch of it, right? It is absolutely sort of different, and he hit on something that I'd sort of double down on, right? Which is you should be thinking through all the pieces that you need. Do they communicate? Are they able to be integrated? If you pick a modern sort of cloud approach, it's going to likely have open APIs. You're going to be able to share information and connect your catalogs to what you want to connect to understand that. If you don't, I think that would be one of the things that we're very aware of. Our customers are as well, that even if you intend to focus on and have the majority of your stuff on a cloud platform and a Databricks or a Snowflake or a BigQuery, whatever, more likely than not, you're going to end up in a multi-cloud world. And the last thing, in addition to everything that Chris said, what we think is important to understand is, as you set up the entire data management infrastructure, are all the pieces able to deal with that? Or are you going to also now end up with a tool stack that only works with AWS, right, and Snowflake, and this one's for over here, because now I've got tool sprawl, right, in addition to sort of cloud stuff. So we one of the things that we have, it's this former, the CEO of Trifacta now in Alteryx, is every decision you make, you should be looking at it like, can I change, if I need to change clouds, can I, right? So with a product like Alteryx, sounds like Unravel as well, like it gives you the flexibility as you go to multi-cloud or move between them. I don't have to rip everything out and start over, right? And if I'm already there, I have the visibility, and you know what? I can run a job over here, and man, that's a great data product or data pipeline, and now I want to execute it over there. I can do that, right? So preserving flexibility and de-risking, how dynamic, because Chris nailed it too. It is a little bit of the Wild West. Whatever you think you know now, new stuff's coming. You're going to acquire somebody, something different will happen 6 months from now. So build in some level of flexibility for that, in addition to the controls and the visibility. And I think that, that would be visibility, control, and flexibility, as I'd have those in mind as I move to the cloud and I chart my future there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, I was talking about, diverse data types, and I'm curious about if you can answer this question, with thinking about not just sort of structured data, but thinking about some of the, either machine data, which is structured, but it's like a newer type, let's just say, or text data, or, image data, or whatever. What are some of the best practices for getting started with the cloud and these diverse data types? Because I think a lot of people, they're migrating over their structured data, probably, even though we see that at TDWI, we see that organizations are using all this diverse kinds of data. Can you specifically talk about any advice or best practices, for dealing with these newer kinds of data in the cloud? Mark, I'll ask you that first.
Yeah, I'm gonna pick up on a point that I think Chris was making, right, which is that some of the new data types that we're talking about here come at you at a velocity and with a scale that could spin out of control pretty quick. So you understand that. What am I going to use it for? Because this thing is going to go really quick, right? Well, you're going to pay for storage, you're going to pay for egress, you're going to, your costs can roll up pretty fast with these potentially massive data sets. So maybe start bite-sized with some of that stuff, understand how it's going to be used, what the run rate of this kind of stuff is going to be before I go hog wild. Because storing it is fun and easy, and they'll take as much as you can throw at them. Right? So definitely that is one. We are big fans of the, and we touched on it already, right? So, being able to have that sort of visibility, control, and governance over the data store, at the same time letting people get used, because it's hard for the central IT team sometimes to know how the business can get value from this stuff, right? So we will see customers, and you'll see the Gartners of the world talk about setting up sandboxes and places to explore some of these things that, again, you can open up access to something if it's a moderately, it's almost like a scaled experiment. And then as you see value getting derived and data products emerging from it, IT can say, okay, well, let's make that industrial strength now. And let me figure out how I'm going to control costs around this and get you what you want. So I like that as well. I think that's a best practice. And that's maybe not even exclusive to new data types, but any new data set. We see that as kind of like a nice hub and spoke model. You give them some ways to experiment and explore and really work with this data to find the value, and then harden what comes out of that's really delivering value.
Yeah, and so the text data, the image data, that sort of thing, and also I guess deciding even what needs to be stored in the first place, right? Because if you have a stream of data, maybe you don't need to store all of it. Maybe you just need to store, the exceptions or whatever,
Yeah,
so
or it expires, right? The value diminishes rapidly, so get rid of it, right?
Yeah, that's true. It's a good point. Chris, how about you? What are some best practices for getting started with the cloud for diverse data types?
I think Mark hit a good point. Look for products that are going to be helpful. Look for if you're doing geospatial data, there's probably a product out there that does geospatial data that you can help with the analysis. I think another bit of it is, and Mark sort of hit on this, value-based. When you start working with the data, when you start looking at this, start small and then see how you can build that value. There's a sort of new practice coming out, from a general IT perspective called ROI ops. And the whole point of it is the cloud is expensive. Why are we spending the money on what we're spending on? And that's one of the key things that we found with other customers, with our wide range of customers, is not only are they trying to figure out where they're spending it, but they're trying to figure out why and if it's worth it. So that's I guess one of the best practices you can have is start small and really start digging into and understanding why you're doing this. And if it's not providing value, why are you paying for it? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and measuring whatever the impact is. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's not so clear. I know that we see organizations all the time. We ask them about their metrics, and some of them just don't, it's not hitting the nail on the head in terms of actually, measuring the value of doing something in a business context. You know what I mean? Like a metric could be, how many people are using my self-service tool, as opposed to like what's trying to come up with a value measure, that would actually help. Anyway, I digress. But yeah, that's interesting, the ROI ops. I guess everything is becoming ops. I wanted to leave time for audience Q&A because I do see questions coming in. So those were the questions that I had prepared. And let's turn it back over to Andrew to ask some of the audience questions that are coming in. So Andrew, back over to you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Fern. A really good conversation. And I think one of the questions that we have here from the audience kind of piggybacks nicely off of the last panel question. So Chris, I'll start with you. And of course, Mark, if you have something to add, please do so. Chris, what criteria should I look at when comparing different cloud vendors?
Oh man, there's so many different things you can look at when comparing the cloud vendors, but I think ultimately what you're looking for is you're going to be looking at the features that they have. At a basic level, everybody's going to have the same sort of stuff, especially when you're dealing with data analysis. Most people can run Spark jobs or whatever, but what it comes down to is what are you looking to do with it, and where's it best going to fit? So, looking at what is Databricks going to provide that can, be something over and above something like a Snowflake. I think the other thing that you have to consider that organizations should really consider when comparing the cloud vendors is potential lock-in. That's not something that anybody really thinks about when they're looking at cloud vendors is, if I'm moving to Databricks, for example, am I going to be using something within Databricks that's specific to Databricks that I end up not being able to move off of? Because eventually there's going to be a new product that, is great or maybe fits your use case better, and now it's going to be significantly more difficult to move off of. So being on the lookout for those kind of vendor specific types of things that would prevent you from moving on is kind of key that we found, and that's why platforms like ourselves operate on an agnostic level. Is it eventually you're going to want to go multi-cloud. You don't want to have yourself locked into one place. Turn it over to Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of nailed it, right? One of the things that we're seeing is the platforms were highly differentiated at first. They just literally were coming at it from different problems, and there's benefits and disadvantages for whatever choice you make. And those platforms, as they mature, are going to add capabilities to handle any kind of data. It won't strictly be a data warehouse or transaction capabilities. So I think, the points you made are the ones that I would echo and maybe add one more, right? So, which is that there's an ecosystem forming around each one of the big planets out there. And so, obviously pick the planet that makes the most sense, but looking at sort of the ecosystem around it too. What partners do they have? What tool sets work really well with them, natively integrated, those types of things, because that might be the tipping thing, right? You can say great things about every last one of the cloud platforms and the databases and data warehouses out there. It's phenomenal what people are building. So potentially the ecosystem, the partners, the other products that are like tightly integrated could be that tipping thing that makes it better for you than a different one.
All right, we'll move on to the next question here. Mark, we'll start with you here. A big motivator for modernization is democratization, where the goal is to expand data usage across the business. But obviously, these democratization initiatives aren't always successful. Can you speak a little bit as to why that might be? And is this a technical issue, or is it or an organic issue, or is it both? Organizational issue, or is it both? Pardon me.
Organizational issue. Yeah. I mean, I honestly think it's usually a bit of both. And sort of to be fair, it's a hard problem to solve, right? We've talked about how dynamic and complex modern data management is. Now let's throw on every, state, national, international sort of regulatory framework. All that piles up, and it becomes very easy to focus on the technical mountain to climb, right? And maybe not pay enough attention to what we were talking a little bit about earlier, that poor end user where the business outcome is going to get decided. Did the data get applied, right? Did it get utilized and make a difference, right? And lead to some insight or breakthrough or faster decision or better decision or a lower cost. So, I think the companies that have really done this well, they've done that, found that balance of I understand the problem is not storing the data. The problem is not, processing the data. The problem is how do I take data and get value from it all the way to the edge of my business? And so, again, hard problem to solve, but the big advantage of cloud and taking a cloud approach and modernizing, and why companies are doing it, right? Even if they're in a highly regulated industry, they're still going to the cloud. It's just that their timeline might be different, right? Might be a little bit stretched out and certain workloads going. But it's all the things that we talked about. It's anytime, anywhere access. It's the scale. It's the ability to govern. It's the ability to bring all this data more or less to one place of different types. So, starting with cloud, balancing that, thinking through all the way through to the end user actually making use of the data, I think are some of the keys to really making it successful.
Yeah, I would just throw in there, if it's okay if I interject, what we also see, sort of the organizational imperative, around the culture, to help democratize and, building data literacy, actually where the company's culture is being able to sort of speak with data and communicate, with data. That's really hard. It's you were saying it before. I mean, it's a really hard problem, but that's something that actually has to happen. I think in our data, we don't see that a lot of organizations have democratized, to the extent that you would think. When we ask, are you making use of these self-service tools? What % of your organization is making use of them? It's not as high as it should be. And it's not like we're expecting it's going to be 80 or 100%, but it's a lot of it is because of the change management, culture, data literacy, those sorts of things. So it's not just about the tools. It's obviously about the people.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I think the other unmentioned thing that we always forget about, time. Sometimes this adoption of new platforms is just, I am doing so much with my job. I don't have time to learn it, and I'm just going to do it the way I know it because it's the quickest. For me, it's the quickest route, and that's what we found. We're talking with a couple customers now, and that's what they have found is the most difficult part about onboarding into any of these new platforms is just the time it takes to actually get there. Once they're there, like you can sit down, and I'm sure Mark, you've had this experience. You can sit down and explain to somebody what Alteryx does. I explain what Unravel does, and they go, "Yes, that makes total sense." And then you sit down to start talking. You actually start implementing, and they go, "I don't have the time to deal with this stuff. I've got 20,000 things under my plate." And it's like, that's the whole point of our platform, is to help you with that time. But it's the initial upfront cost of onboarding and understanding it that it seems to be the enemy of everything.
Yeah, I think you're right. But that would be like a big point of advice to me, which is to almost think through, like, where am I devoting my time and what am I spending my time on that would then maybe go away, right? So for us, one of the huge things is we see over and over and over again, before you make a move like this, you spend 80% of your time like preparing the data. You're not analyzing it. You're not getting value from it. And even data scientists, right? They're just doing it with code. But if you can go from 80% to 5%, like, what does that mean? Oh my God. Like, how much more can I actually do as opposed to just the grunt work of kind of trying to get some data to help me make a decision, right?
Fantastic. Well, I think we have one more question within our time allotment here. So, Mark, I'll start with you. But again, Chris, if you'd like to add something, please do so. When you look at the future of the modern data world, what do you think are going to be some of the biggest developments that organizations should pay attention to and prepare for?
Well, I think we definitely hit on one, which is, I think it's inevitable that we're all going to sort of be multi-cloud, right? And that has sort of pretty significant implications, and we've talked a fair bit about those. I do think the other thing, and I'll come back to, I think I might have touched on this in the beginning, which is that I think that data and this entire world becomes much more of a teams of people collectively working to analyze data, as opposed to I'm the lone data scientist or data engineer. I'm coding up a 800-line Python script, right, or whatever, and making something happen. Because I think I know what the person who's going to consume this data pipeline needs, right? It's going to be very dynamic. The data is going to be there. We talked all about that. It's going to be there. If the company allows it, you'll have access, right? Teams of people that know what the data can mean can start to work on data products and pipelines and advanced analytics and feeding ML models, as opposed to sort of it being a little bit of a one-person exercise. And that, to me, I think everything, I don't want to say everything, but most things get better when you bring more brains to the party. So that's potentially pretty exciting, how that's going to play out.
I think the saying is diversity is the spice of life. So I could definitely see that applying to these sorts of teams and whatnot. I'll add one more thing onto that, and it's something that actually, Mark, you mentioned earlier. One of the things that Unravel does is we actually apply artificial intelligence to the data that we gather. So just like, customers gather data, we're gathering data on those jobs and stuff like that. What we're going to see in the future is more platforms leveraging the telemetry data that they gather and things of that nature to be able to provide insights that look like what a developer might, or look like what a data scientist might. So it becomes those platforms become a force multiplier for the workforce, because now instead of having 5 people working on it, they have an automated system that's doing it in the background. And then when those 5 people sit down and look at it, they're going to see those insights and be able to go, oh, I can right size my job, or oh, potentially this the data quality is bad here. I can modify this and make a better quality model out of it. So I think AI and ML is, as much as it's buzzwords right now and we talk about it, I think there's going to be actual practical applications in the modern data world outside of just applying it to create artificial intelligence of, just a human thinking.
Terrific. Well, this does unfortunately bring us to the end of our time today. So let me thank our speakers. Thank you, Fern, Mark, and Chris, for your time today. It was a fantastic presentation. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, both Alteryx and Unravel, for sponsoring today's webinar. And please remember that we recorded today's webinar and we'll be emailing you a link to an archived version of the presentation. You can feel free to share that with colleagues if you'd like. And of course, if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, you can use the click here for a PDF line. Finally, I'd like to remind you that TDWI offers a wealth of information, including the latest research, reports, and webinars about BI, data warehousing, and a host of related topics. So I encourage you to tap into that expertise at tdwi.org. And of course, from all of us here today, thank you very much for attending. This does conclude today's event.